60 seconds. That's all it took to end 11 years. 11 years. Gone in 60 seconds. But here's what nobody in that room understood. Not the executive pointing at the door, not the staff frozen in the hallway, not even Ruth herself. The girl she had just stepped in front of was not just some lonely teenager in a luxury house. Her father had a very long reach, and he was already watching. The question isn't why Ruth did what she did. Anyone who's ever met a woman like Ruth already knows the answer to that. The question, the one that changes everything, is what happens when the most dangerous man in Seoul finds out that the only person in his daughter's life who acted like a human being was thrown out into the street for it. That answer took everyone by surprise, including Ruth. Ruth Washington was 63 years old, and if you asked her what that felt like, she probably would have told you she didn't have time to think about it. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, the second of 4 children raised in a house where you learned early that hard work wasn't optional. It was the only language the world around her seemed to respect. So she learned it, fluently, and she never stopped speaking it. She married James Washington when she was 28 years old. A quiet man, a steady man. He worked the floor of a manufacturing plant for 26 years. Same plant, same shift. Then one Tuesday morning, a Tuesday, the most ordinary day of the week, James Washington collapsed on that factory floor. No warning, no insurance. Gone. Ruth was 55 years old. She buried her husband with money she borrowed from her church, paid it back inside of 8 months. Then she sat down at her kitchen table to figure out what came next. Her daughter Camille was brilliant in the way that needed room to grow. She had gotten into a pre-law program on a partial scholarship. Partial in the way that sounds impressive until you see the remaining balance. Tuition, housing, books. The little things that add up to a number that doesn't care about your grief or your age or the fact that your hands have been shaking since the funeral. Ruth needed income that matched the problem. So when a placement agency reached out about a household management position in Seoul, South Korea, working for a high-end corporate family, live-in full package, Ruth Washington did not romanticize it. She did not call it an adventure. She looked at the number, looked at Camille's tuition bill, and said yes. She had never left the country before. She packed 2 suitcases and a worn Bible that had been her mother's. Inside the front cover, her mother had written 4 words in blue ink. God sees you, baby. Ruth had read those words in good times and hard ones. She read them the night before her flight. Then she closed it, put it in her carry-on, and got on the plane. That was 11 years ago. In 11 years, Ruth had learned enough Korean to navigate a grocery store, a pharmacy, and the particular tone of voice a household executive uses when they want you to know you are beneath them, without actually saying it out loud. She had learned the rhythms of a house that was not hers, which hallways echoed, which doors needed to be pulled, not pushed. She knew which staff member cried in the laundry room on Sunday evenings, and which one was skimming from the household grocery budget. She knew things because she paid attention. She sent money home every month. Not sometimes. Every month. Without fail. Camille called her every Sunday, and Ruth answered every call with the same steady voice, the same laugh that sounded just like her mother's. She never told Camille about the nights she sat alone in the staff kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, eating whatever was left over from the family's dinner, too tired to cook for herself and too proud to say so. She had a photograph of James on her nightstand. Not a framed one. Just a photograph, slightly bent at the corner from years of being handled. In it, he was standing in their backyard in Birmingham, squinting into the sun, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too large that he refused to throw away. Ruth looked at that photograph every night before she slept and every morning before she started the day. She did not feel sorry for herself. That was not her nature. But she was human. Some nights, in a city where she did not belong, she missed James so deeply it felt like a second loss. Fresh. All over again. But morning always came. And Ruth Washington always got up. That was the thing the people in that household would come to deeply underestimate. Ruth did not stay because she had no options. She stayed because she had decided to. She had given 11 years to that household. 11 years of showing up, doing the work, and keeping her head down. And in all that time, In all those years of watching and working and quietly noticing everything, there was one thing in that house that Ruth could never make peace with. The girl, Shin Yuna, 17 years old. Quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned that noise does not bring comfort. She moved through that house like someone who had accepted she was an afterthought. Ruth noticed her the first week. She never stopped noticing her. And that one thing, is what started everything that came after. To understand what happened in that household, you have to understand how it was built. Not the architecture. Not the marble floors or the imported furniture or the silence that only very expensive houses have. You have to understand the structure of it. The human structure. Who stood where. Who answered to whom. And who made sure everyone remembered it. Seo Hyuna had been the executive director of the Shin Corporation's private household operations for 9 years. She was meticulous in the way of someone whose authority was the most important thing she owned. Every staff schedule, every household expense, every interaction between the domestic team and the Shin family passed through her first. Nothing moved in that house without her approval. And some things moved because she allowed them to. She was not cruel in the way that announces itself. She was cruel in the way that hides behind procedure, a clipped voice, a clipboard, a smile that never reached the eyes. She did not raise her voice. She didn't have to. She had the power to end your employment with a single phone call. And every person on that staff understood that. They understood it the way you understand a current in water. You can't always see it, but you know what happens if you stop paying attention. Ruth had worked under people like Seo Hyuna before. She recognized the type. You keep your head down, you do your work with excellence, and you do not give them a reason to look at you directly. For years, Ruth had managed it. Then came Shin Yuna. Yuna was 17 years old, the only child of Shin Jae-won, a man who owned everything around her and was present for almost none of it. Her mother had passed when Yuna was 4. The grief had no specific memory attached to it, only an absence so constant it had become the background of her entire life. She did not have friends in the way teenagers are supposed to have friends. She had tutors. She had scheduled activities. She had a household staff that was trained to meet her practical needs and maintain a professional distance from everything else. She ate alone most nights at a table designed for 12. She moved through rooms that had been decorated by people who had never met her. And she was watchful. Watchful in the way children become when they have spent years reading rooms instead of being held in them. Ruth noticed all of it. She noticed the way Yuna's eyes tracked the staff, not with entitlement, but with a quiet hunger to be seen. She noticed the way the girl would slow down near the kitchen when Ruth was working, not asking for anything, just gravitating toward the warmth of someone who moved like they had purpose. She noticed that Yuna never left food on her plate when Ruth was the one who had prepared it. The first incident happened on a Wednesday afternoon in October. Ruth had been passing through the east sitting room when she found Yuna asleep on the sofa, still in her school uniform, a textbook open across her chest, clearly exhausted in the way teenagers get exhausted when no one is making sure they rest. The room was cold. A window had been left open. Ruth went to the linen closet, retrieved a blanket, and placed it over the girl. That was all. She did not wake her. She did not make a production of it. She simply covered her and kept walking. By the following morning, Seo Hyuna had called a staff assembly. She stood at the head of the room and addressed the junior staff with Ruth present, and she stated, clearly, deliberately, in front of everyone, that physical contact with members of the Shin family, including the placing of personal items on their person without request, constituted a violation of household protocol. She did not say Ruth's name. She did not have to. Every eye in that room found Ruth anyway. Ruth stood still. She said nothing, but she understood what had just happened. A line had been drawn, and it had been drawn specifically around her. Over the following weeks, Seo Hyuna began what could only be described as a quiet campaign. Every act of warmth Ruth extended toward Yuna was documented. The extra portion at breakfast. The cup of tea left outside Yuna's study room door. The afternoon Ruth spent an additional 20 minutes helping Yuna locate a misplaced school assignment when it was not strictly within her duties. Each one logged. Each one framed in a memo Ruth never saw as unprofessional attachment. A phrase that sounds clinical until you understand that it was being used to describe a grown woman caring whether a lonely child ate her breakfast. There was an afternoon, near the end of November, that Ruth did not forget. She was restocking the pantry shelves when Yuna appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether the room was safe to enter. Then she asked very quietly, "Do you have children?" Ruth said yes. One daughter. Back in the States. There was a pause. The kind that means someone is working up to something they've been holding for a while. Does she know she's lucky? Ruth did not answer that. There was no answer that would have been adequate. Instead, she crossed the small distance between them and took the girl's hand and held it. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Yuna to understand that she had been heard. 3 weeks later, Yuna developed a fever. It came on quickly, the way fevers do in winter. By mid-afternoon she was pale and slow-moving, and by evening she was in her room with a temperature that needed attention. Ruth went to find the household physician on call. She was told he would not be available until the following morning. She went to Seo Hyuna's office to report the situation. Seo Hyuna's response was measured. "She is to rest. Ensure the room is adequately heated. Good night, Mrs. Washington." The door closed. Ruth stood in that corridor for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen. She made soup from scratch. The way her own mother had made it for her in Birmingham when she was small. The way that took time and care and meant something. She brought it to Yuna's room on a tray with a glass of water and 2 aspirins she retrieved from the household medicine cabinet, which was absolutely within her authorization. Yuna sat up slowly. She looked at the tray. She looked at Ruth. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Ruth sat in the chair by the door until the girl fell asleep. The following morning, Seo Hyuna sent a formal notice to HR. Ruth Washington had engaged in unauthorized meal preparation outside of scheduled kitchen hours. The incident would be reflected in her employment record. Equivalent to 1 week's wages docked. Ruth read the notice at the staff table. She folded it in half. She put it in her pocket. She went to work. Ruth was paying attention now. Not just to Yuna. To everything. Every act of love Ruth showed that child was treated like a crime. She understood that. What she did not yet understand, what none of them understood, was why. Why was Seo Hyuna so determined to keep distance between the staff and Yuna? Why was every thread of genuine human connection being cut the moment it formed? And why, when Ruth looked closely, did certain members of the household staff seem less like employees and more like people who had been positioned there deliberately, watching the girl, yes, but not to protect her? But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was still 3 weeks away, and nobody saw it coming. There are moments that look ordinary from the outside, a dinner, a hallway, a few seconds of exchange between people, that are underneath, the kind of moments that redirect the entire course of what comes after. This was one of those moments. The dinner had been planned for 3 weeks. Seo Hyuna had overseen every detail with the particular intensity she reserved for events that carried corporate weight. The guest list was specific. 12 people. Senior representatives from 2 international trade delegations, 2 legal consultants whose names Ruth had never heard, and a collection of mid-level executives from partner organizations whose job that evening was to eat well, drink well, and feel important. The household staff had been briefed twice. Assignments were clear. Movements were mapped. Every person on that team knew exactly where they were supposed to be and exactly how long they had to be there. Yuna had been given a single instruction. Appear at 7:30. Greet the guests. Be present for 30 minutes. Say nothing of substance. Disappear. She was 17 years old, and this was not the first time she had been deployed like a prop in her own home. Ruth had watched her get ready from the hallway. Yuna had stood at the mirror in her room in a dress that fit perfectly and matched everything, and suited her the way formal clothes suit people who would rather be wearing something else entirely. She looked older than 17. She also looked exhausted in a way that 17 should not look. Ruth had said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have helped. She simply made sure the girl's collar was straight before she went downstairs, and Yuna had held still for that, just for a second, the way she always held still for small, practical kindnesses, like she was storing them up. The dinner proceeded exactly as these things proceed when they are managed well. Conversation moved through the room in the careful, surface-level way that corporate gatherings demand. Seo Hyuna circulated with the quiet authority of a woman who had choreographed this 100 times before. The staff moved without being seen. The food arrived on schedule. Yuna appeared at 7:30, as instructed. She greeted the guests. She was polite. She was composed. She said exactly the right amount of nothing. Ruth was positioned near the service corridor, managing the transition between the main course and dessert, when she noticed Yuna slip out through the side door that connected to the east hallway, the quiet route back to the residential wing. It was just past 8. Her 30 minutes were done. She was doing exactly what she had been told. Ruth watched her go. Then she watched Director Kwon set down his glass and follow her. He did it without announcing himself, without excusing himself from the table. He simply rose and moved, with the particular ease of a man who has spent a career walking through spaces as though they belonged to him, and slipped through the same side door 2 minutes after Yuna. Ruth set down what she was holding. She moved through the service corridor to the east hallway entrance, the long way, the staff route, and when she came through the door at the far end, she saw them. Yuna had her back against the wall. Not by choice. She had been stopped mid-corridor. There was nowhere else to go, and Director Kwon was standing close enough that the space between them no longer existed. He was speaking in a low voice. Ruth could not hear the words from where she stood, but she did not need to. She could read Yuna's body from 30 feet away. The absolute stillness of it. The way the girl had made herself small and rigid at the same time. The way people make themselves when they are trying to disappear inside their own skin. Kwon reached for her arm. Ruth was already moving. She walked the full length of that corridor without running. Not because she wasn't urgent, but because she understood that the way you arrive matters. She did not come in frantic. She did not come in loud. She came in steady, and she came in direct, and she placed herself between Director Kwon and Shin Yuna with the kind of physical certainty that leaves no room for interpretation. She looked him in the eye. The young lady needs to return to her room. There was a beat of silence. The kind of silence that happens when a man is surprised, not frightened, not remorseful, surprised that he is being spoken to at all. Then he laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. He looked Ruth over slowly. The worn elbows on her uniform. The gray in her hair. The absolute lack of deference in her posture. "Excuse me," he said. "Do you know who I am?" Ruth did not look away from him. "Yes, sir. And right now that doesn't matter." He stared at her for a long moment. And in that moment, several things were true simultaneously. Ruth was a 63-year-old woman in a household uniform with no institutional authority over this man whatsoever. She had no leverage, no rank, no protection beyond her own willingness to stand exactly where she was standing. And she did not move. Something in Kwon's face shifted. Not into shame, nothing so honest as that, but into the particular recalculation of a man who understands that a scene here will cost him more than walking away. He straightened his jacket. He looked past Ruth at Yuna, once, with a look Ruth made note of and would not forget. Then he turned and walked back toward the dining room. Ruth did not exhale until he was through the door. She turned to Yuna. The girl was pressed against the wall with her arms wrapped around herself, and she was shaking. Ruth did not reach for her immediately. She simply stood close, present, solid. After a moment, she said quietly, "Go upstairs. Lock your door. I'll bring you something in an hour." Yuna looked at her. Something passed across her face that was too large and too complicated to name. She nodded, and she went. Ruth stood in that corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Then she turned to go back to the service wing. Seo Hyuna was standing at the far end of the hallway. She had been there long enough to have seen what she needed to see. Her face was arranged in its usual precision, composed, unreadable in the particular way of someone who has already decided what they are going to do and is simply completing the observation. Her eyes met Ruth's. Neither of them spoke. Seo Hyuna turned and walked back toward the dining room. And while Ruth had spent that night sitting quietly outside Yuna's door making sure the girl slept, Director Kwon had spent it on the phone. And Seo Hyuna had spent it writing a termination letter. 11 years. They ended it in a single night. They called her in at 7 in the morning. Not 8. Not 9, when the rest of the household would be moving, when there would be witnesses in the corridors and people passing through. 7, when the building was still quiet and Seo Hyuna had arranged for the morning schedule to begin late, and there was no one around to watch what was about to happen. That was not an accident. Ruth had been awake since 5. She had made her bed, pressed her uniform, read 4 verses from her Bible, and eaten a small breakfast alone in the staff kitchen. She did not know what was coming, but she had worked long enough in rooms controlled by people like Seo Hyuna to understand that a 7 o'clock summons was never good news dressed up in formality. She knocked on the office door at exactly 7. She was told to come in. Seo Hyuna was seated behind her desk. Her posture was the same as it always was, straight, composed, the kind of deliberate stillness that is its own form of authority. Beside her sat a woman Ruth recognized from the corporate HR division. Ruth had spoken to her exactly once in 11 years, during her initial onboarding. The woman did not make eye contact. On the desk, already printed, already aligned precisely with the edge of the blotter, was a single sheet of paper. Ruth saw it the moment she entered the room. She knew what it was before anyone spoke. Seo Hyuna did not offer her a seat. She said, and her voice was level, measured, the tone of someone delivering a decision that has already been finalized and requires only the formality of being spoken aloud. She said, "Mrs. Washington, last evening you created a disturbance in front of international corporate guests. You inserted yourself into a situation that was not within the scope of your duties. You violated household protocol. Effective immediately, your employment with the Shin household is being terminated. 2 months severance has been calculated and is included in the envelope before you. We will require your staff identification and your room key before you leave the premises." Ruth stood still. She let the words settle. All of them. Every carefully constructed, procedurally precise word of it. Then she asked, quietly and without heat, "Has Director Kwon been addressed?" The silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words could have. Ruth held it for a moment. Then she asked, "Is Yuna all right?" Seo Hyuna's expression did not shift by a single degree. "That is not your concern." 4 words. Not your concern. 11 years of 5 o'clock mornings. 11 years of covering a sleeping child with a blanket and making soup from scratch and sitting outside a teenager's door in the dark to make sure she was safe. 11 years of showing up in a country that was not hers, for a family that was not hers, in a house that would never be hers. Not your concern. Ruth looked at Seo Hyuna for a long moment. Then she stood slowly, straightened her jacket, and folded her hands in front of her. "I understand," she said. She picked up the envelope. She placed her staff identification card on the desk. She removed her room key from her pocket and set it beside the card. She did not slide them across. She placed them down with the same care and precision with which she had done every other task in that household for 11 years. Then she turned and walked out of the office. The corridor was still quiet. Her footsteps were the only sound. She passed the staff kitchen where she had eaten 1,000 breakfasts alone. She passed the linen closet where she had retrieved the blanket that started all of this. She passed the east hallway entrance where she had walked 30 feet to stand between a child and a man who had no right to be that close to her. She did not look at any of it. She went to her room. She packed quietly, methodically, the same way she did everything. Then she carried her bags to the entrance hall. She was at the bottom of the main staircase when she felt it, the particular weight of being watched from above. She looked up. Yuna was standing at the top of the stairs. She was still in the clothes she had worn to bed. Her eyes were red in the way that eyes get red when someone has been crying for hours and has run out of tears and is still not done. She was gripping the banister with both hands. She looked very young. She looked like exactly what she was, a 17-year-old girl who had just watched the only person in that house who had ever genuinely cared for her being removed from her life before 8 in the morning. Ruth stopped. Their eyes met across the full length of that staircase. Ruth did not call up to her. She simply gave her the smallest nod. Yuna's grip on the banister tightened. Ruth picked up her bags and walked out through the front entrance of the Shin household into the Seoul morning. The air was cold. The street was beginning to fill with the early movement of a city waking up, delivery vehicles, a woman in a yellow coat walking a dog, the distant sound of a train. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a world that had no idea what had just happened inside that building. Ruth stood on the pavement for a moment. She had 2 months of wages in a manila envelope and 11 years of her life behind a door that had just closed. She thought about Camille, about the tuition bill, about James, about the photograph on the nightstand she had just packed into her carry-on bag for the second time since Birmingham. Then she picked up her bags and she started walking. And what happened next, nobody in that building expected. Because while that household had been focused on removing Ruth Washington from the equation, someone else had already started asking questions. And that someone did not ask questions the way ordinary people ask questions. He asked them the way a man asks questions, when the answer will determine what happens to the people responsible. And he had already received his first answer. Shin Jae-won did not operate in a world most people could locate. No letterhead, no public address, no entry in any corporate registry. He had moved through a different kind of structure for 30 years, older, quieter, and responsible for more than most people would ever be permitted to understand. The call came at 3 in the morning. Not to a corporate switchboard, not to an assistant, directly, to a number that very few people had, and that even fewer had the standing to use at that hour. The room where he received it was not an office in any conventional sense. It was a private space, quiet, deliberately sparse, the kind of room that belongs to a man who has learned over decades that comfort makes you slow and clutter makes you careless. There were other men in that room. They were seated. They did not speak unless spoken to. That was not a rule anyone had ever stated out loud. It was simply understood. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, the hand that set the phone down did so without urgency. Deliberate. Still. On the wrist, a watch that cost more than most people's annual salary. Not because Shin Jae-won was the kind of man who needed to display what he had, but because he had worn that particular watch for 19 years, and he was not sentimental about many things, but he was sentimental about that. The room waited. Then his voice, low, measured, the kind of voice that has never needed volume to command full attention. Tell me again what happened to my daughter. The man who answered was senior enough to be in that room, and not senior enough to be comfortable in it. He repeated what he knew. The dinner, the corridor, Director Kwan, the staff member who had intervened, the termination that followed before sunrise. He stumbled twice over his words. Shin Jae-won let him finish. He did not interrupt. He did not react in the way that men with lesser discipline react when they are told something that produces fury. He did not raise his voice, did not move suddenly, did not make the room feel dangerous in any theatrical sense. He simply stood. He adjusted his jacket. And then he said, with the particular quiet of a man whose instructions have never required repetition, "Find out who protected her, and find out who fired them." That was all. The men in the room understood that those 2 sentences contained everything necessary. The first was a directive rooted in something that had nothing to do with business. The second was a question that had everything to do with it. Shin Jae-won had not become who he was by reacting. He had survived 30 years in a world that most people do not know exists, and he had not survived it through force alone. He had survived it through patience, through the discipline of allowing information to arrive completely before he decided what it meant and what it required. But there were exactly 2 things in this world that Shin Jae-won did not extend patience to: disrespect to his organization, and harm, in any form, at any scale, from any direction, toward his daughter. Those 2 things operated on a different set of rules entirely. To understand what his reaction meant, you have to understand who Yuna was to him. Yuna was the only heir to something that had been built across 3 generations. Something whose influence did not appear in any public document. She was, in the language of the world her father occupied, irreplaceable. Not as a business asset, as a human being. As the one person on this earth that Shin Jae-won had ever allowed himself to be completely without armor around. He had failed her in visible ways. He knew that. The absent father, the managed household, the expensive substitutes for actual presence. He carried that knowledge with him the way men carry the weight of choices they cannot unmake. But his love for that girl was not diminished by his failures. If anything, it was sharpened by them, made more ferocious. and someone had followed her down a corridor. And someone else had thrown out the only person who had moved to stop it. His people had the answers to his 2 questions within 6 hours. The person who had protected Una was Ruth Washington. 11 years of employment. Her file, to anyone reading with clear eyes, was a catalog of kindness that someone had reframed as misconduct. She had been docked pay for it. Twice. And then terminated. He stood at the window of that quiet room as the city below him moved through its early morning routines, entirely unaware of the calculations being made above it. A woman named Ruth Washington had protected his daughter when no one else in that household had moved. She was somewhere in Seoul right now with a manila envelope and nowhere to go. Jae-won reached for his jacket. The guest house was clean, small, the kind of place that exists in every major city for people who need somewhere to land. Ruth had found it on her phone while sitting on a bench 3 blocks from the Shin household. She had not allowed herself to sit on that bench for long. Sitting too long in the cold with nowhere to go is the kind of thing that can get into your thinking, and Ruth could not afford for anything to get into her thinking right now. So she had booked the room, picked up her bags, and walked to the nearest subway station with the same deliberate purpose she brought to everything. The room had 1 window, a narrow bed, a small desk, a radiator that worked but made a sound doing it. She set her bags down, hung her coat, and sat on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a while without moving. Then she picked up her phone and opened the job listings she had been quietly, privately monitoring for the past several weeks. Because Ruth Washington had been reading that household long enough to understand that her position in it had become fragile, even before the corridor, even before the dinner. She had known something was turning. She had simply not known how fast. The listings were not encouraging. Not at her age. Not without a reference from her most recent employer. Not in Seoul, where Seo Hyuna could poison any reference with a single phone call. Ruth looked at the screen for a long time. Then her phone lit up with a different kind of notification. Camille. She stared at her daughter's name on the screen through 2 full rings. 3. Ruth picked up. "Hey, baby." And her voice was steady. Warm. It carried none of the weight of the last 24 hours. None of the cold morning, none of the termination letter, none of the envelope on the desk beside her, none of the image of Una at the top of the stairs with red eyes and both hands on the banister. Her voice was just her voice. The one Camille had been hearing her whole life. Solid. Familiar. Safe. Camille asked how she was doing. Ruth said she was fine. Tired but fine. You know how it gets this time of year. All the corporate events. They run you into the ground. She laughed. It sounded like her real laugh, almost exactly. She asked about classes. She asked about the study group Camille had mentioned the week before. She asked whether her daughter had been eating properly, and Camille said, "Mama, I'm 24. And Ruth said, "That is not an answer." And Camille laughed, and for 4 minutes and 30 seconds Ruth Washington sat in a guesthouse room in Seoul and was simply a mother talking to her daughter. Then she said she had to go. Early morning tomorrow. Camille said she loved her. Ruth said she loved her more. She ended the call. And she sat in the silence that followed for a long time. The rain had started sometime while she was on the phone. She could hear it against the window now, steady, indifferent, the kind of rain that doesn't build or ease but simply continues, as if it has all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. She reached into her bag and set James's photograph on the desk beside the envelope. Then, after a moment, she turned it face down. She couldn't look at him tonight. Not because she was angry. Not because she blamed him for anything. James Washington had not chosen to leave, and Ruth had never once, in 8 years of widowhood, allowed herself the cruelty of pretending otherwise. But there were nights when his face in that photograph made the loneliness so specific, so located in a single point in her chest, that she needed to put it away. Not forever, just for tonight. She reached into the same bag and drew out her Bible. It fell open where it always fell open, a page so worn and so repeatedly visited that the spine had simply surrendered to the habit of it. The words on that page were underlined in pencil, in her mother's hand, from decades before Ruth was old enough to understand them. She read them. She read them a second time. Then she closed the Bible, held it against her chest with both hands, and spoke to the empty room in a voice just above a whisper. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Not a breakdown. Not a collapse. Ruth Washington did not collapse. But this quiet, private, plainly spoken admission to a room that held no one, the full weight of it had finally arrived. She had been strong for everyone her entire life. For James through his bad years at the plant. For Camille through the grief of losing her father at 16. For a little girl in a foreign country who was not her family and not her blood and not, by any institutional definition, her responsibility. Ruth had shown up for all of them. Every single time, she had shown up. And now she was 63 years old, alone in a room the size of her old kitchen in Birmingham, and there was no one to show up for tonight but herself. She simply sat, and the city moved around her in the dark. While Ruth sat in the dark, 40 minutes across the city, a file was already being assembled. Shin Jae-won's organization did not need warrants. It did not need cooperation. It had its own timeline, and when something of sufficient importance demanded it, that timeline moved faster and more thoroughly than anything operating within official boundaries. They were not loud about it. They were never loud about anything. Loudness is for people who need to be believed. These men simply needed to know. And knowing, for them, was a matter of access and patience and professional detachment. The ability to look at everything without deciding in advance what it meant. The security footage was the first thing. The Shin household operated on a closed internal camera system, standard for a property of that value and that profile. What was less standard was the fact that Seo Hyuna had administrative override access to that system, a privilege she had been granted 4 years earlier, ostensibly to manage staff compliance reviews. By the time her assistant arrived at work the morning after the dinner, 2 segments of corridor footage had already been flagged for deletion. The request had been submitted at 11:50 the previous night, less than 3 hours after director Kwon had left the building. Jae-won's people pulled the footage before the deletion processed. The full corridor sequence. Kwon following Yuna through the side door. The 2 minutes before Ruth arrived. Ruth's arrival. The confrontation. Kwon's departure. And then, the detail that nobody in that household had thought to consider. The angle from the secondary camera at the far end of the corridor, which showed Seo Hyuna standing at the hallway entrance. Watching. Not arriving. Not responding to a disturbance. Standing. Positioned. As though she had already known where to look. That footage was preserved, catalogued, and placed at the front of the file. Director Kwon's background took slightly longer. Not because the information was difficult to find, but because there was a great deal of it, and it had been buried with considerable care across multiple jurisdictions and a number of years. This was not the first time. That was the sentence that sat at the top of the summary his people prepared. Not the first time director Kwon had been the subject of a complaint involving a young woman in a professional or social setting. There had been 3 previous incidents across a span of 9 years. 2 had been resolved through private settlements that required non-disclosure as a condition of payment. 1 had been quietly dropped after the complainant's employer, a mid-sized trade consultancy, lost 2 significant contracts in the months following the filing. The consultancy's largest client at the time had been a subsidiary connected to Kwon's network. Every one of those incidents had been buried. Every one of them had cost someone something significant. And in each case, the person who had paid the price was the person who had told the truth. Then came Ruth's employment record. When laid out in full, cross-referenced against household logs and scheduling documents, what emerged required no interpretation. Every formal mark against her in 11 years corresponded directly to an act of care toward Yuna. What Seo Hyuna's memos called unprofessional attachment was, read plainly, a catalog of kindness that someone had reframed as misconduct. And alongside each of those marks was a timestamp. The infractions had been logged quickly, consistently, within hours of each incident, not filed during a routine review, entered deliberately in real time as though someone had been watching and waiting for Ruth to do exactly what Ruth did, and recording it the moment she did. Someone had been building a case against Ruth Washington long before the dinner. The termination letter confirmed it. It had been drafted at 9:47 the previous evening. The dinner had ended at 9:15. Seo Hyuna had begun writing Ruth's termination before the guests had finished their dessert. And then came the piece of information that reframed everything that had come before it. Seo Hyun-ah and director Kwon had a professional arrangement that did not appear in any official document connected to the Shin Corporation. It ran through a consulting intermediary, a small firm registered under a name that required 3 layers of corporate records to connect to either of them. The arrangement had been in place for 2 years and 4 months. In that time, Kwon had directed 3 contract referrals to Shin Corporation subsidiaries, valuable ones, the kind that enhanced Seo Hyun-ah's professional standing and secured her position. In exchange, Seo Hyun-ah had provided Kwon with something considerably less formal. Access. Access to the household. Access to events. Access to the rhythms and schedules and movements of the people inside it. Access, specifically, to an environment where Shin Yuna could be encountered in settings that felt private. Unmonitored. Safe in the way that predators define safety, meaning safe for them and for no one else. Seo Hyun-ah had calculated that Jae-won's distance from the household made the arrangement effectively unmonitorable. She had been wrong. Ruth Washington had not simply protected Yuna from one bad night in a corridor. She had walked into the middle of something that had been constructed carefully over more than 2 years. She had disrupted an arrangement between 2 people who had a great deal to lose. And she had done it without knowing any of it existed, without knowing that the corridor, the dinner, the particular position Yuna found herself in that evening, had all been shaped by decisions made long before Ruth arrived at work that day. She had stepped in front of it anyway. And they had removed her before sunrise because she was the only variable in that household they had not been able to account for. The only person whose next move they could not predict and could not control. Jae-won sat with the file in front of him. His people had assembled it across 2 pages, dense and precise. He read it once. He did not read it twice. He did not ask questions about the contents or request clarification on any point. His expression did not change. He closed the file. Then he asked one question. Just one. Quiet and direct, and carrying beneath it the full weight of everything he had just read. Where is the woman now? His people had that answer too. A guest house. 38 minutes from where he was sitting. Room booked that morning, paid in cash from her severance envelope. No onward reservation. No return flight booked yet. Jae-won stood. He reached for his jacket. He said nothing further. The people in that room had worked with Shin Jae-won long enough to understand that when he reached for his jacket and said nothing, it meant that the thinking was finished. What came next was not thinking. What came next was action. And for the people who had spent 2 years building something inside his household, for the people who had thrown out the one woman who had moved to protect his daughter, the window in which any of this could have gone differently had just closed. The prior incident file, Kwon's documented history across 3 prior complaints, was referred the same morning to the relevant authorities. Ruth had been awake since 5:30, not because she had slept poorly, though she had, because Ruth Washington did not know how to stay in bed when there was a problem that needed solving, and right now the problem was considerable and the bed was not helping. She had showered, dressed, repacked her bags so they were ready to move if she needed to move them, and walked 4 blocks to a small cafe she had passed the previous morning on her way to the subway. It was the kind of place that did not require you to be anyone in particular. Mismatched chairs, a counter with a glass case, the smell of something baking that she could not identify, but that made the room feel, briefly, like somewhere a person could think clearly. She ordered coffee and sat at a table near the window. She opened her phone. She had already sent Camille's portion for the month, the first thing she had done that morning, before she even made the bed. What remained was hers to work with. 3 months, maybe 4. To find a position in a city where Seo Hyun-ah could poison any reference with a single phone call. She was scrolling through a placement agency's listings, reading each entry with the particular focus of someone who cannot afford the luxury of discouragement, when the black vehicle pulled up outside. She noticed it the way Ruth noticed everything, without staring, without reacting, simply registering it and returning to her screen. Black vehicles were not uncommon in this part of the city. Plenty of corporate traffic moved through here in the mornings. But then the door opened, and the young man who stepped out was wearing a suit that had been cut for him specifically, not off a rack, not adjusted, cut, and he walked with the purpose of someone given clear instructions and intending to carry them out. He came through the cafe door. He did not look around the room. He walked directly to Ruth's table, and he stopped, and he reached into his jacket, and he placed a card in front of her on the table. One name, one number, nothing else. Mr. Shin would like to speak with you. Ruth looked at the card. She looked at the young man. His posture was correct. His expression was professional without being cold. He was perhaps 25. He had the particular stillness of someone trained to wait without filling the silence. Ruth said, "Which Mr. Shin?" She said it evenly. Not with suspicion, not with fear. With the practical precision of a woman who has learned that clarity at the beginning saves considerable confusion later. The young man simply waited. And in that waiting was the answer, because there was only one Mr. Shin whose name on a card, delivered to a cafe table by a young man in a bespoke suit, required no further identification. Ruth looked at the card for another moment. She thought about Yuna at the top of the stairs. She picked up the card, put it in her pocket, and reached for her coat. She had nothing to lose. She went. The vehicle moved through the city with the unhurried efficiency of a car whose driver has never once needed to rush because the roads, in the ways that matter, have always been clear for him. Ruth sat in the back and watched Sol pass through the window and said nothing and thought a great deal. She had worked for the Shin household. She knew the name. But the Shin household, as she had known it, was Seo Hyuna's domain, corporate, managed. The family presence felt only in the instructions that filtered down through channels. In 11 years, Ruth had never met the man at the top of it. He had been, to her, a name on documents and an absence at dinners. She turned the card over in her pocket without taking it out. The meeting was conducted in English, standard for both of them in a context like this. And when Ruth entered the private room at the back, Shin Jae-won was already there. He was standing. Not pacing, standing. Jacket on. Hands at his sides. When Ruth entered, he turned, and he looked at her with an attention so complete and so direct that most people would have found it destabilizing. Ruth met it without flinching. Then he did something she had not expected. He bowed. Not a casual inclination. A formal bow. Deliberate. Unhurried. She inclined her head in return. He gestured to the table. She sat. He remained standing for one more moment, the habit of a man who thinks more clearly on his feet, and then he sat across from her. He said his name, plainly, without title. And then he said, "I am Yuna's father." Ruth had been holding herself in the precise, measured composure she had maintained since 7 o'clock the previous morning. The composure she had held through the termination letter and the room key and the corridor and the photograph face down on the desk and the phone call with Camille where she had laughed her real laugh for 4 minutes and 30 seconds and then ended the call and sat alone in a room by herself. She had held all of it. And then Shin Jae-won said those 3 words, and something in Ruth's chest released. She said, "How is she?" Not "Why am I here?" Not "What do you want from me?" Not "What is going to happen now?" How is she? Jae-won looked at Ruth Washington across that table, and something moved across his face that he had not anticipated having to manage in this meeting. He had not prepared for that question. He sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with an honesty that surprised even him by how plainly it arrived, "She is asking for you." Ruth held those words. She did not respond immediately. She did not perform a reaction for the room. She simply held them the way she held things that mattered, carefully, with both hands, giving them the full weight of her attention. Neither of them needed to say what had brought them both to this table. They both already knew. Shin Jae-won told her the truth. All of it. He did not soften it. He did not translate it into language designed to make it easier to receive. He told her the way men tell the truth when they have decided that the person across from them has earned it. Plainly, directly, with the particular respect that comes from not assuming someone cannot handle what is real. He told her about the organization. Not in full. There are things Shin Jae-won would never say in any room, to any person, under any circumstances. But enough. The scope of it. The reach. The fact that the Shin name, as the world understood it, was only the surface of something considerably older and considerably more complex than any corporate registry suggested. He told her about Seo Hyuna, the arrangement with Kwon. how long it had been running, what it had provided each of them. The consulting intermediary, the contract referrals, the access. He laid it out in the same sequence his people had assembled it, without embellishment and without apology, because apology at this stage would have been inadequate and J1 knew it. He told her what Kwan's intentions had been. The 2 years of positioning. The way the household schedule had been subtly shaped to create opportunities that looked, from the outside, like ordinary corporate entertaining. The way Yuna's movements within that household had been quietly, incrementally made more predictable. He told her how close it had come. Not to the corridor. Before the corridor. The access Seo Hyuna had been facilitating had been escalating for months in ways that had gone undetected, because the person overseeing household security reported to Seo Hyuna. A structure that had been put in place to protect the household had been turned, by degrees, into the mechanism that made the household vulnerable. Ruth sat through all of it. She did not shift in her chair. She did not look away. She did not perform the reaction that most people perform when information of this weight arrives. The visible processing, the expressions of horror, the interjections. When J1 finished, the room held its silence for a moment. Then Ruth asked, "Did anyone else on that staff know?" J1 said, "2 of them." Ruth's voice did not change. "Are they gone?" "Yes." Silence. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people sitting with the full understanding of how close something catastrophic had come to occurring, and what it had taken to stop it, and what stopping it had cost. Ruth looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at J1 directly. That little girl has been alone in that house for years. Not because of money. Because every person around her was hired for a reason that had nothing to do with her. She did not say it with anger. She did not say it as an accusation designed to wound. Shin Jae-won looked at the table. Not at his hands. Not at the wall. At the table. The way a person looks at a fixed point when they are holding something that has no good place to go. The silence stretched. Then he said, "I know." 2 words. Ruth had no reason to protect him from it. So she didn't. He had expected to conduct a meeting. He had not expected to be understood. He looked up from the table. Ruth was still looking at him. Patient. Still. The same steadiness she had brought to every room she had ever entered. He said, after a long moment, "I would like to discuss what comes next, if you are willing to hear it." Ruth picked up her tea glass. "I'm listening." Justice, when it comes from a man like Shin Jae-won, does not arrive with noise. There are no press conferences, no public statements, no dramatic gestures designed to be witnessed and remembered. Men who have operated for 30 years in the space between what is visible and what is real do not require an audience for the things that matter most to them. They require only that the outcome is correct and permanent. Shin Jae-won was very good at permanent. Seo Hyuna learned this on a Tuesday. It began, as these things begin when they are done properly, with paperwork. A corporate compliance review, routine in its framing, thorough in its execution, initiated through channels that Seo Hyuna had no visibility into and no ability to anticipate. The financial arrangement with Director Kwan surfaced not through accusation, but through documentation. Transaction records. Communication logs. The consulting intermediary that had seemed for 2 years and 4 months, like an airtight construction, revealed itself, under sustained examination, to be exactly what it was, a mechanism for exchanging access for advantage, running through the household of a man whose organization did not forgive that kind of transaction. The review was completed in 31 hours. Seo Hyuna was removed from her position on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the investigation had been referred to 2 additional bodies whose involvement she had not been informed of in advance and could not have prepared for. By Thursday evening, the professional network she had spent 20 years constructing, the references, the relationships, the carefully maintained reputation as one of the most reliable household directors in the corporate sector, had been made aware of the review's findings through the same quiet channels that had surfaced the arrangement in the first place. No one called her. No one needed to. In the world Seo Hyuna operated in, silence from the people who matter is its own complete communication. And by Friday morning, that silence was total. She had built her entire adult life around being indispensable to powerful men. She had not considered what happened when one of them decided she was the problem. 20 years. 72 hours. Director Kwan's situation required even less effort. Jae-won did not pursue legal action. He did not make calls. He did not issue instructions that crossed any line that could be documented or challenged. He did something considerably simpler and considerably more effective. He stopped. He stopped returning calls. Stopped acknowledging introductions. Stopped allowing his name to appear in proximity to Kwan's in any context, business, social, or otherwise. In the legitimate corporate world, this would have been an inconvenience. In the specific, layered world that Kwan had spent his career navigating, the world where certain introductions open certain doors and certain affiliations grant certain protections, Jae-won's withdrawal was not an inconvenience. It was a verdict. Within 2 weeks, Kwan's board positions were under review. Within a month, 3 contracts had been quietly redirected to other firms. Within 6 weeks, the handshake deals that had constituted the real architecture of his professional life had, one by one, stopped being honored. No one broke any law. No law needed to be broken. Kwan simply discovered, at the age of 54, what it meant to be on the wrong side of a silence. And then there was Ruth. The contract arrived at her guest house the morning after their meeting, delivered by the same young man, in a sealed envelope. Ruth sat at the small desk by the window and she read it. She read it the way she read everything important, slowly, completely, without skipping anything, and without deciding what she thought about it until she had reached the end. The position was not household staff. The title, as written, was personal guardian and senior advisor to Shin Yuna. The responsibilities were described in plain language: her presence, her counsel, her judgment. The things Ruth had already been providing for 11 years without the title or the protection or the compensation that should have accompanied them. The apartment was in the same building where Yuna lived. Her own entrance. Her own space. Not a staff room. Not a converted storage area given a coat of paint and a narrow window. A home. The salary was listed on the 3rd page. Ruth read the number twice. Camille's tuition. The monthly wire transfer that had structured every financial decision Ruth had made for 3 years. The quiet, persistent anxiety of it. The calculation that ran beneath every other calculation, always present, never fully silent. That number on the 3rd page of that contract made the anxiety stop. Not reduced it. Stopped it. And on the final page, separate from the contractual terms, written in a different register entirely, a letter. Not a corporate communication. A letter. From the Shin Corporation, under Jae-won's direct authority, formally acknowledging that the termination of Ruth Washington's employment had been executed improperly, under false pretense, by individuals acting outside their sanctioned authority. That her 11 years of service had been exemplary. That her actions on the evening in question had been correct. That the corporation was in her debt. It was signed by Jae-won himself. Not a proxy. Not a legal representative. Him. Ruth read the letter once. She set it down on the desk. She looked at the window for a long moment. Then she looked at James's photograph, face up now, retrieved from her bag and set back in its place that morning, and she held it for a moment before setting it down gently beside the letter. Then she picked up her phone and called Camille. She had told her daughter that everything was fine on the previous call. Steady voice, real laugh, not a word of it true. She had protected Camille from it the way she protected everyone from the things she was carrying. Out of habit, out of love, out of the long practice of being the person in the room who holds it together, so that everyone else doesn't have to. Not this time. This time, when Camille answered, Ruth told her the truth. All of it. The dinner. The corridor. The termination letter on the desk before 7 in the morning. The envelope. The bench 3 blocks from the household where she had sat and booked a guest house room on her phone. The card placed on the cafe table. The file. The arrangement. How close it had come. The contract on the desk in front of her right now. All of it. Camille was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that isn't absence. The kind that is full. Someone on the other end of a phone line taking in the full weight of what they have just been told and understanding, piece by piece, what it means, what it cost, what it came close to, what it had produced. Then Camille said, her voice careful and low. "Mama, you stepped in front of a stranger's child in a foreign country and lost your job for it." Ruth said, "Yes." A pause. "Daddy would have done the same thing." Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth and held the phone, and she did not speak for a moment. James would have done the same thing. She knew that. She had always known that. He was the kind of man who fixed things before you noticed they were broken. He was the kind of man who moved toward trouble when everyone else was deciding whether it was their place to get involved. He would have walked that corridor without hesitating, and he would have said the same thing Ruth had said. "Yes, sir. And right now that doesn't matter." She stayed on the phone with Camille for a long time after that. The way they had always talked, on Sunday evenings across an ocean, and a time difference in years of distance that had never managed to make them feel far apart. When she finally ended the call, the room was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than the night before. The night before, the quiet had been the weight of everything that had been lost. This quiet was something else. Something that had more room in it. Ruth picked up the contract. She signed it. What came next was something Ruth Washington, at 63 years old, had not allowed herself to fully imagine. A beginning. The key was new. Still bright, still sharp at the edges. The way keys are before years of use have softened them into something familiar. Ruth held it in her palm for a moment before she went inside. Not hesitating, just acknowledging it. The weight of a small thing that meant something large. Her own entrance. Her name on a contract. An apartment on the 14th floor of a building she had entered, until yesterday, only through the staff corridor. She went in. The lobby was quiet at this hour. Marble underfoot. The kind of light that is designed to be restful rather than impressive. She took the elevator without being directed to it, without being escorted, without anyone in a pressed uniform noting her arrival in a logbook. She took it because it was her building now, in the way that matters. Not owned, but belonged to. The distinction Ruth understood better than most. She rode up to Yuna's floor. She walked the corridor she had walked 100 times before and stood outside a door she knew well. The grain of the wood, the particular sound the floor made 2 steps before it, and she knocked. 3 seconds. The door opened. Yuna was still in her morning clothes. Her hair was not arranged. She had clearly been awake for hours and had not made any effort to look like she hadn't been, which meant she had not been expecting to perform anything for whoever came to that door. She had simply been waiting, openly, without pretense. She looked very young standing there. She looked very relieved. She did not know what to do with her hands. She had them at her sides, then crossed at her chest, then at her sides again. 17 years old, the heiress to something vast and complicated, standing in a doorway not knowing what to do with her hands because the person she had been waiting for was finally on the other side of it, and there was no protocol for this moment, and she had not prepared any words. Ruth looked at her for just a moment. Then she opened her arms. And Yuna stepped into that embrace the way people step into something they have needed for so long that the need itself has become background, constant, unexamined, present in every room without being named. She stepped in like a person who had forgotten that this was available to her. Like a person who had been cold for years and had stopped noticing the cold because cold was simply the condition of every room she had ever stood in. And then it wasn't. Ruth held her the way she had held Camille through hard things. Completely. Without rushing it. Without making it into a lesson or a moment or anything other than exactly what it was. A woman and a girl, in a doorway, on a Tuesday morning, with 11 years of everything that had led here settled quietly around them. Ruth heard people. Not what they said. What they meant underneath it. And Yuna, who had spent 13 years in houses full of people who were paid to be there and trained to maintain their distance, had felt it from the first week. Had felt it and moved toward it the way people move toward the one warm thing in a cold room. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, across months and years of small gravitational pulls that Seo Hyuna had documented as unprofessional attachment, and that were, in fact, simply the truth of what was happening between them. Something real. In a house full of arrangements. Later that afternoon, Ruth set up her laptop on the kitchen table of her new apartment and called Camille. Yuna was in the next room. She had asked, with the particular careful casualness of someone who does not want to seem like they are asking too much, whether she could stay for a while. Ruth had said yes in the same tone. No ceremony, no production. And Yuna had settled onto the sofa with a book she was not reading and the specific contentment of a person who simply needed to be near someone. When Camille's face appeared on the screen, Ruth turned the laptop slightly, so Yuna was in the frame. Camille saw her immediately. She looked at her mother. Camille smiled, full warm, entirely her mother's daughter, and said, "I've heard about you." Yuna blinked. "Good things," Camille said. "The best things." And then something happened in that apartment on the 14th floor that had not happened in any room Yuna had occupied in a very long time. She laughed. Think about that corridor for a moment. 30 feet of hallway. A man who believed his position made him untouchable. A 17-year-old girl with nowhere to go. And a 63-year-old woman at the far end of it who had every practical reason in the world to turn around and walk back to the service kitchen and tell herself that it was not her place. The job, the salary, Camille's tuition, 11 years of showing up without incident, all of it sitting on one side of the scale. And on the other side, a girl who was not hers, not her blood, not her family, not, by any definition that the world around her recognized, her responsibility. If this story reached you, if something in it reminded you of a person in your own life who moved toward something hard when they didn't have to, who stood somewhere difficult because it was right and not because it was safe, share it with them. Because they do. They are in corridors right now, closing the distance at full cost without hesitation. And they deserve to be seen.